Today we're finally reviewing EVGA's 1080 Ti SC2 Hybrid that we tore down before Computex. This will probably be one of the last 1080 Ti's that we review for some time, and that's because the FPS is really pretty much the same. So is overclocking between all of these AIB partner models, but there's one really important aspect that's not looked at too frequently, and that is noise as it compares to thermals, particularly when you normalize for one of them and test all the coolers at the same dBA output. Before that, this content is brought to you by custom backplate makers at v1tech.com. V1Tech builds GPU backplates to order with their online customization tool, making it easy to theme upcoming PC builds. Backplates cost $25 and up and are installed via magnet and can be seen in some shots of the cards we're reviewing lately. Use code GAMERSNEXUS5 for $5 off your order or click the link below. So this is the SC2 Hybrid. We tore it down previously as stated and showed that, as we've seen in the past cards, there is a VRAM cooling plate that connects by thermal paste to the CLC, which is an EVGA liquid cooler that's made by Asetek. It's an Asetek 4.5 gen pump. Those run a bit faster than Gen 4 at around 3,600 RPM, plus or minus a couple hundred RPM, and it's got an EVGA fan on it. They've done some changes to the cooling solution for this round of hybrid cards versus the previous round, but the main thing of note is that this is still an SC2, so it's the same PCB as the other SC2, the air-cooled one, which is the same PCB as the reference card, and it's still got the SC2 add-ons like the ICX thermistors on it, the NTCs that are on the board. So this card is not too different from the SC2 that we already reviewed. For that reason, we're not even going to look at gaming performance in this video because honestly, it's pointless. It's going to be the same. The thing that we care about here is just thermals and then noise as it relates to that. We've got all the tests on that, of course. In terms of interior construction, it's got the VRAM plate for cooling on the memory modules, and then there's actually a separate piece once you pull the shroud off, and we can show our teardown footage of the VRM cooling component. So that's a tiny fan that's atop an aluminum heat sink, which is just a fin stack, and that covers your VRM components, whereas the VRAM is covered by the plate, and then the backside has the normal aluminum die-cast plate split into two with thermal pads to connect to the backside of the PCB. The VRM fan really doesn't do a whole lot unless it has to. It tends to sit passive at 0% RPM when it's not under any workload at all. And then once you put a real gaming workload or a power virus workload on it, it'll go to about 28% of its total spinning, its RPM availability, and that tends to be about 870 to 900 RPM. So it's really quiet. It doesn't really pick up on a noise meter if you're running with the radiator fan under any kind of load anyway, basically making the VRM fan silent because it's just going to be covered up by everything else in the system. And then the radiator fan, as we'll get into with the noise testing, still runs a bit louder. EVGA has had this thing for a while now where their cards tend to be a bit louder but also cooler than their competition. Finally, they're doing something about that. It does seem like the cards are getting quieter with time. This is the first hybrid card we've tested where it's actually closer to 40 dBA rather than being at something like 44. So good on them for listening to that criticism and moving to improve. There's still some things they could do. For example, currently in this state, the radiator fan slaves to the liquid temperature, which is an Asetek thing. That's not really something that EVGA has control over. There's a thermocouple stuck into the pump block, and it's coated in a ton of thermal paste, and that is what tells us the liquid temperature. EVGA has this fan slaving to that temperature, which tends to be something like 26 to 32 Celsius or thereabouts. Doesn't really go higher than that. And because liquid temperature doesn't go higher than that almost ever, the fan is following a parameter that doesn't make a lot of sense to follow. But with the new 6th generation of Asetek pumps, that should change. We talked about that in our Computex coverage at the Corsair suite, if you're curious to learn more about that. Let's get into the testing. As always, you can find the full testing methodology in the article that's linked in the description below. We're starting off with a really simple chart. This is frequency versus time, so there's really only two things to look at here, frequency and temperature over a time axis. And as you can see, it's fairly smooth overall. Starting out, we don't really lose a whole lot off the clock from the get-go like we do with a lot of the air coolers, but you do still have dips at times. Moving on to more important testing like thermals versus the SC2 non-hybrid, and then later we'll test with the VRAM plate on versus off in an A/B test. We can see in this chart that the SC2 and SC2 hybrid are easily compared, given that their thermistors are located in the same places, though we do actually place our own thermocouples on the card as well, in addition to EVGA's NTCs. Our ability to compare these two cards directly is in contrast to the FTW3, which is not comparable in power component readouts, given its completely different power design and, more importantly, its different NTC location on the board. We've seen some people online compare the FTW3 and SC2 thermistors to each other in temperature testing, but unfortunately it doesn't really work like that because they're in different spots. EVGA is doing better this generation with hybrid cooling as stated previously, and seems to have learned that running a 100% radiator fan speed all the time isn't actually necessary. That's reflected in these results. We don't see quite as big of a thermal improvement as in previous generations, but that's because the noise levels are actually tolerable now and have gone down. This has been EVGA's biggest weak point for a long time now, and they're working to resolve the noise output while meeting expectations thermally. The SC2 Hybrid looks to be about at the right place, ranking 20 Celsius lower than the SC2 non-hybrid and GPU diode readings, about 13C lower in MEM1, 10C lower in MEM2, 9C lower on MEM3, and then power component temperatures are also down a bit across the board. Now, regarding the previous numbers and some of the other ones coming up, a couple quick notes here. We take thermals a lot more seriously than you might be used to if you're new here, and that means that some of what we do involves logging different types of thermal readouts. And for these two, that would be VRAM and one of the power components to validate EVGA's NTCs and make sure that they're telling an accurate measurement of the temperature, and also just so that we have comparable data to our previous test. Then we run another set of thermocouples to monitor the ambient temperature, and that is used to apply a modifier to the results as necessary to make sure that we've normalized for ambient as best we can. And then further, our testing measurements, the averaging for the numbers that you see in the bar charts, not the over time charts, is done at steady state. So that's once the GPU has stopped fluctuating, at least within reason. Because of the way we're working with the modifier now, not all values are going to be a hard delta T over ambient, but some of them are. If they are, we'll mention it and the chart will say so. We're moving now to our noise normalized charts, where we configure the cards to run at a 40 dBA output. This helps us understand cooling efficiency per card rather than just its stock performance. Stock performance, of course, is highly variable and will hinge completely on whether the manufacturer built for noise or for thermals. Here, we're looking at strictly the cooling efficiency at a fixed noise output, and we're not yet normalizing for power, but might do that in the future. Starting with GPU numbers, the EVGA 1080 Ti SC2 Hybrid is the second coolest on our charts, operating a sustained 24.9 Celsius delta T over ambient. This places the card about 20C cooler than the FTW3, though the FTW3 had some testing caveats that we detailed in our unveiling of this test method, which was the ASUS Strix review, primarily that we configured the fans to asynchronous speeds. The Extreme Aorus card is nearby, with the Gaming X still showing the prowess of MSI's twin Frozer dual air cooler design. ASUS keeps hold of the best efficiency for an air cooler title and is outranked only by the liquid cooled devices, by about 6 Celsius at that. The Armor is the worst card we've tested when air-cooled, but its Gaming X PCB makes it an excellent candidate for H2O, which is what you see here. The Armor CLC is a 570 LC, and we're also using a Gentle Typhoon fan, but there's something else that's more important. EVGA is sharing its liquid cooling solution with a copper plate that conducts from the VRAM, increasing the heat load relative to the constant heat dissipation. We are increasing our heat load by approximately 15 watts by doing this because we're also cooling the VRAM. But again, these are just the GPU temperatures. Moving now to power component temperatures, we see the SC2 runs a warmer VRM target than its neighbors at 42.2 Celsius delta T over ambient, near the Gaming X and the FTW3. This is another situation like the FTW3 where we could have configured the VRM fan to run faster while the radiator fan could have run slower, but we ultimately decided to follow EVGA's own fan curve. The curve dictated a roughly 28% VRM fan RPM under load, which fit well with our 70% radiator fan RPM for a 40 dBA output jointly. Performance is neither impressive nor bad. We are well within spec of these FETs, even when measuring what is effectively a case temperature. Finally, here's a look at VRAM performance. The SC2 Hybrid manages to keep the lowest VRAM temperature of all, largely thanks to EVGA's decision to cool the VRAM via copper plate that contacts the CLC, and the other cards, at least some of them, are not far behind. But we were curious how much that copper plate would actually impact things if removed, so we ran some A/B tests with it taken off. The radiator fan was configured to 100% for these tests, with the VRM fan again at 28%. Our difference in GPU temperature is within error bars and so is effectively identical. The rest of the temperatures see a hike, particularly for memory. The copper plate improves performance from 66 Celsius to 55 Celsius on Mem 1, 73 to 58 on Mem 2, pretty big jump, and from 68 to 61 Celsius on Mem 3. Power follows this trend, just to a lesser degree. Finally, here's a look at the noise output versus various RPMs on the radiator and VRM fans. Under auto settings, the EVGA card tends to stick just around or right under 40 dBA, plus or minus 3 dBA, depending on how heavy the load is when it is closer to those lower load scenarios. And we still think EVGA could improve their noise with these cards, but it does start to enter territory where your max temperatures run higher for lower noise. And although that reflects well for folks who care about noise, it might not look good in less scrupulous reviews or for more casual users. Thermals are good here. They're not the best temperatures we've ever seen out of an EVGA hybrid card, but that's for a few reasons. One of them, EVGA is finally figuring out fan curves to balance the noise level to the temperatures, because you don't need to run a 30 or 40 Celsius core temperature at the risk of really high noise. So they've figured that out, and that means that noise has gone down, which is great, but temperatures, of course, have gone up a little bit. It's still much cooler than most of the air-cooled cards, although the Asus Strix is a pretty good competitor if you do prefer air. It's just at $780 as well, so there's that to consider, and check out our Strix review for the rest on that. This thing also contributes to what appear to be higher GPU diode or core temperatures, because again, you're increasing the amount of heat in watts. We're adding about 15 watts of heat cooling the VRAM to the CLC. This is getting synced to the CLC, and so of course your temperatures are going to look a bit higher, and that's part of that as well in terms of generational improvement between the EVGA hybrid series, or in this case, generational slight increase in GPU temperatures at auto settings, because they've actually improved things. So it's not quite as cut and dry as, is it cooler than previously? Clearly, because it's not necessarily cooler than previously, but it's still better as a whole. So EVGA has done well there. Now, this is still an $810 card. It's not going to game better than a $720 card. It's not going to game better than the SC2 Black Edition for the most part. There will be a slight change because the clock rates are a bit different, and that's really about it. If you really cared about that 1%, 1 to 3% change, you could overclock the card. They're going to overclock pretty close to the same because they're all 1080 Ti's. That doesn't really change until you start getting into exotic cooling or into custom BIOS tweaking, like with a Kingpin or with a Lightning card. It's going to be the same for gaming performance. What does matter is noise and temperatures. Temperatures are pretty close to some of the better air-cooled cards. The Gaming X at $750 does just fine. The FTW3 at $780 also does fine, although we would recommend the Asus Strix over that one, which is also $780. But for noise levels, you can get a lot further with liquid, which is what this does. So if noise is something that you care deeply about, then it's not a bad idea to grab something like this or look into one of the other CLC cards. We haven't reviewed the Seahawk because they've really just not been available this generation. But this card, if you care about noise, what you should do is probably connect a different fan or plug this one into the motherboard. Control the fan speed manually, set it to 1 speed permanently, because you could run it at 40% and it'll be fine for life. And then you also get rid of the change in noise, where you get the frequency change as the fan ramps. So you get rid of that, you have a lower noise output in dBA, you have a more consistent noise output in frequency, and you have similar cooling performance to the best air-cooled cards, but quieter. So that's the way to use this card. Now, that does mean that a lot of people get priced out, and that's fine. Don't buy it if that doesn't work for you, or if you don't care about that, because $800 is too much if you don't care about noise and you're buying one of these. But that should pretty much wrap it up. If you need more information, click the link in the description below. You can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to help us out with this testing directly, or you can go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab a shirt like this one, the GN Graph logo. Although thanks to you all, we are almost out of stock again. So subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.